Most people experience payday as a moment of relief. The number in the account increases, the immediate anxiety of the past few days or weeks subsides, and there is a brief sensation of financial adequacy before the obligations begin arriving, and the number starts its predictable decline toward the next payday. The cycle repeats monthly or biweekly or weekly, depending on how your income is structured. And for most people, it repeats with remarkable consistency across decades, not because they are careless or irresponsible, but because no one ever taught them to think about the moment of income arrival as a strategic decision point rather than merely a logistical event. That is what payday actually is. It is a strategic decision point. It is the moment at which the raw material of financial life income is available to be allocated, and the allocation decisions made at that moment, repeated consistently over years and decades, are the primary determinant of whether you build genuine financial independence or remain perpetually in the cycle of income and obligation that characterizes most financial lives. The decisions are not made once, they are made every payday, and their power derives entirely from that consistency. A single payday decision, however well considered, is financially trivial. The same decision made at every payday for 20 years is financially transformative. I want to work through what I would actually do on payday, not as a theoretical exercise in financial planning, but as a concrete step-by-step description of the thinking and the allocation sequence that I believe is most structurally aligned with building genuine wealth rather than merely managing income. This is not a budget template. It is a philosophy made operational, a way of translating a set of structural convictions about how value is created and preserved into specific actionable behaviors at the specific moment when those behaviors have the most leverage. So before I describe the steps, I want to establish the framework of thinking that underlies all of them, because the steps without the framework are just instructions, and instructions without understanding are fragile. They break down the first time a complicating circumstance appears because the person following them does not understand why they are following them. The framework is more important than any specific step. The framework begins with a single distinction that most financial advice either ignores or handles insufficiently: the distinction between consumption and investment. Consumption is spending that produces immediate value, pleasure, comfort, convenience, experience that is fully realized at the point of spending and does not produce further value afterward. Investment is spending that produces ongoing value, capability, assets, productive capacity, options that extends beyond the moment of spending and ideally compounds over time. Every allocation of income falls somewhere on the spectrum between pure consumption and pure investment, and the aggregate ratio of consumption to investment in your financial life over time is the primary determinant of whether your financial position improves, stagnates, or deteriorates. This distinction is not a moral one. Consumption is not wrong. Human life requires consumption to be worth living. The food, the shelter, the recreation, the relationships, the experiences that make life genuinely good rather than merely productive are consumption in the technical sense, and I am not advocating for a life organized entirely around financial optimization at the expense of everything that makes the optimization worthwhile. What I am advocating for is deliberateness, the decision to consume consciously, having first allocated to investment at the level that your trajectory requires, rather than consuming by default and investing whatever remains after consumption has taken its share. The sequence is the critical thing. If consumption comes first and investment comes from the remainder, investment is always underfunded relative to what it could be, because consumption, in the absence of deliberate constraint, expands to fill available income with remarkable consistency. This is not a character flaw. It is the predictable response to an environment saturated with consumption opportunities, social comparison, and the constant suggestion that your current level of consumption is insufficient for the life you deserve. Managing this environment requires a structural response, a sequencing discipline that removes the investment allocation from the consumption decision entirely by making it automatic and prior rather than discretionary and subsequent. The second element of the framework is understanding that income is not the variable that determines long-term financial outcomes. The variable that determines long-term financial outcomes is the percentage of income that is consistently allocated to genuine wealth-building activity, to assets that work independently of your labor, to capability that compounds over time. to the structural foundations of financial independence. This percentage is far more important than the absolute level of income, which is why there are people earning significant salaries who have built no meaningful wealth and people earning modest incomes who have built genuine financial independence. The difference is not luck primarily. It is allocation, discipline, sustained over time. The third element of the framework is an honest assessment of what genuine wealth building activity actually consists of, because this is where most financial advice either oversimplifies or misleads. Genuine wealth building activity is not merely saving money. Saving money is the absence of consumption, which is a necessary condition but not sufficient. It is the direction of that saved capital toward things that produce value without requiring your continued labor equity in productive enterprises, assets that generate income, capabilities that generate leverage. Money sitting in a savings account earning 2% while inflation runs at 4% is not building wealth. It is losing it slowly in a way that feels safe because the nominal balance is stable. With this framework established, let me work through the actual sequence, the step-by-step process of what I would do every payday, in the order in which I would do it. The first thing I would do on payday, before anything else, is separate the strategic from the operational. This is a mental step before it is a financial one. I would sit with the arrival of income for a moment, not to celebrate it, not to begin spending it, but to recognize it clearly as a decision point. The income that has arrived is not already spoken for. It is raw material, and what it becomes depends entirely on the decisions made in the next minutes and hours. This moment of deliberate recognition, however brief, is the beginning of treating financial life as something you manage actively, rather than something that happens to you. The practice of pausing before allocating is not trivial. In the absence of this pause, the default behaviors take over. The mental accounting of which obligations need to be met, the awareness of which purchases have been deferred, the subtle drift toward treating the income as already spent before any deliberate decision has been made. The pause interrupts this default and creates the cognitive space in which deliberate allocation can happen. It does not need to be long. It needs to be deliberate. The second step is allocating immediately to investment, not after expenses, not after reviewing what is left, but first, before any other allocation is made. This is the operational implementation of the principle that investment must come before consumption rather than after it. The specific percentage depends on your circumstances, your income level, your existing obligations, your stage of life, the gap between where you are and where you need to be. What I can say is that the percentage needs to be meaningful enough to actually change your trajectory, and that for most people, this means more than they are currently allocating and more than feels immediately comfortable. I do not prescribe a specific number, because the honest answer is that the right number is the highest number that you can sustain indefinitely without creating genuine financial instability. The sustainability criterion matters as much as the size criterion, because a high allocation rate that is unsustainable will be abandoned, and an abandoned allocation discipline produces nothing. The goal is to identify an allocation to investment that is genuinely significant, genuinely moving your financial trajectory in a different direction, and genuinely sustainable across all the payday cycles through which life's complications and surprises will inevitably arrive. This allocation should be executed automatically, meaning it should require no decision at the moment of execution. The transfer to investment accounts, retirement accounts, brokerage accounts, or whatever vehicles you are using should happen without requiring your active choice each time. The automation is not merely a convenience. It is a structural protection against the natural human tendency to find compelling reasons in any given month why this particular month the circumstances are unusual enough to justify reducing the investment allocation and using the money for something else. If the decision is required each time, the special circumstances will be found each time, because there are always special circumstances, and the allocation will be chronically lower than intended. Automation removes a decision from the consumption context entirely, and what is never seen as available is never consumed. The third step is allocating to what I call the security buffer, the reserve of liquid assets sufficient to cover several months of essential expenses without requiring income. This is the component of financial allocation that is most commonly described in conventional financial advice, and I will not spend extensive time on the case for it because it is genuinely well understood. The security buffer exists to absorb the inevitable shocks, the income interruption, the unexpected expense, the period of transition, without forcing you to liquidate long-term investment positions at unfavorable moments, to take on high interest debt, or to make financial decisions under duress. What is less commonly addressed is the specific size and character of the security buffer that is actually appropriate for different people in different circumstances. The conventional advice of 3 to 6 months of expenses is a reasonable starting point, but should be calibrated to the specific volatility of your income and the specific character of your obligations. A person with highly variable income from freelance work or entrepreneurial activity needs a larger buffer than a person with stable employment income because the probability and potential magnitude of income disruption is larger. A person with significant fixed obligations, mortgage payments, dependents, medical expenses needs a larger buffer than a person with highly flexible expenses that could be reduced substantially in an emergency. The key insight about the security buffer that is most often missed is that it is not an investment, it is insurance. Its purpose is not to grow or compound, but to be reliably available when needed, which means it must be held in instruments that prioritize liquidity and nominal stability over return savings accounts, money market accounts, short-term treasuries. The return on these instruments is modest and will typically be negative in real terms over long periods. This is the cost of the insurance. It is a cost worth paying because the alternative being forced to liquidate long-term investment positions at the worst possible moments, which tend to coincide with exactly the economic conditions that produce the income disruption, is far more expensive. The security buffer should be funded before long-term investment is maximized if it is not already at an adequate level. A person who is simultaneously building a long-term investment portfolio and carrying no meaningful liquid reserve is taking on a specific structural vulnerability. They are building long-term value while remaining exposed to the kind of short-term shock that forces expensive liquidation of that long-term value. The two activities are in tension, and the resolution is to prioritize the buffer until it is adequate, then direct the full investment allocation to long-term vehicles. The fourth step is servicing obligations, debt payments, fixed contractual commitments, essential recurring expenses. I place this fourth rather than first deliberately because the conventional sequencing that places obligations first is one of the primary structural reasons that investment is consistently underfunded. When obligations are paid first and whatever remains is available for investment, the obligations tend to expand over time to fill available income, and investment remains chronically residual. Placing investment allocation first, even before obligations, is a statement about priority that forces the obligations to be managed within the constraint established by the investment allocation rather than allowing the obligations to establish their own constraint on what is available for investment. This requires, in practice, that the total of your obligations and your essential consumption not exceed the portion of your income remaining after investment allocation. This constraint is real and it binds. It means that decisions about debt, about fixed commitments, about the size of your essential expense base are made in full awareness of the investment allocation they must be compatible with. Many people make commitment decisions, the size of the mortgage, the car payment, the subscription commitments, the lifestyle baseline, without fully accounting for the investment allocation. Those commitments must coexist with. The result is a financial structure in which investment is chronically crowded out by commitments made without reference to it. I want to address debt specifically here because it deserves more nuanced treatment than the simple pay it off as fast as possible advice it usually receives. Debt exists on a spectrum defined primarily by its interest rate. High interest debt, credit card debt, personal loans at double-digit rates, payday loans is a genuinely destructive financial position. The interest cost of this debt compounds against you in exactly the way that investment returns compound for you, and eliminating it is one of the highest return financial activities available to anyone carrying it. There is no investment with a guaranteed return of 15 to 20% per year available in any legitimate financial market. Eliminating debt that costs 15 to 20% per year is the equivalent of that investment, and it should be treated with corresponding priority. Low interest debt mortgages at current rates, student loans at below market rates, any debt whose interest cost is lower than the expected long-term return on broadly diversified equity occupies a more ambiguous position. The mathematical case for carrying this debt while investing the capital that would otherwise retire it is often genuinely valid because the expected investment return exceeds the debt cost. But this mathematical case ignores the psychological cost of debt, the ongoing weight of obligation, the constraint it places on future flexibility, the vulnerability it creates to income disruption, which is real even when the numbers favor carrying the debt. My own disposition is to weigh the psychological cost seriously and to favor eliminating debt more aggressively than the pure mathematics would suggest, especially for people who are sensitive to the psychological burden of ongoing obligation. Financial optimization that produces chronic psychological stress is not actually optimal. The fifth step is allocating to essential consumption the baseline expenses of life that are genuinely necessary for functioning. Housing, food, transportation, utilities, healthcare, the basic infrastructure of daily life. This category needs to be funded adequately for genuine functioning and not much more, because its tendency to expand with available income is one of the primary mechanisms through which investment is crowded out. The essential consumption category is also the one most subject to the lifestyle inflation that destroys the investment capacity of people whose income grows over time. As income rises, the natural tendency is to upgrade the quality and scale of essential consumption, larger housing, newer vehicles, more elaborate food arrangements in ways that consume the income gains that could otherwise be directed to investment. Lifestyle inflation is not irrational. Some of it genuinely improves quality of life in ways that are worth the cost. The problem is that it tends to happen automatically and unconsciously, rather than deliberately and selectively, which means it tends to be distributed across many categories rather than concentrated in the categories where the genuine improvement in quality of life is largest. The person who deliberately decides to spend significantly more on the specific consumption categories that most directly improve their well-being and productivity, on genuinely good food, on a genuinely good sleeping environment, on genuinely good tools for their most important work, while holding other consumption categories stable, is making a qualitatively different decision than the person who upgrades everything proportionally as income rises. The former is deliberate investment in quality of life. The latter is lifestyle inflation that primarily benefits the producers of status signals. The discipline of managing essential consumption within a predetermined constraint established by the prior allocation to investment, security buffer, and obligations is the operational implementation of the principle that consumption should follow investment rather than precede it. This discipline is uncomfortable in specific ways that deserve acknowledgement. There will be periods when the consumption constraint feels tight, when things you could technically afford if you redirected investment funds are unavailable because those funds are already allocated. This discomfort is the price of the investment discipline, and it is a price worth paying, but it helps to understand it clearly as a price rather than experiencing it as an inexplicable and arbitrary restriction. The sixth step is allocating to what I call discretionary investment in your self-spending that is not investment in financial assets, but investment in your human capital, your specific knowledge, your capabilities, and the relationships and experiences that compound into long-term productive capacity. This is the category I described in another context as the spending you should never be cheap about. Books, courses, events, tools, the experiences that genuinely expand your thinking and your capabilities, the professional development that deepens your specific knowledge. I place this after the core investment allocation and after essential consumption because it requires discretionary income. It is not an obligation, and it is not a financial asset investment, but I place it before purely recreational consumption because its long-term return is categorically higher than recreational consumption, and it deserves to be treated accordingly. The person who allocates their discretionary income to genuine capability investment, who consistently prioritizes books over entertainment subscriptions, professional development over lifestyle upgrades, genuine experiences that expand their thinking over passive recreation, is making investments that compound into the quality of their judgment and the depth of their specific knowledge in ways that have direct economic consequences over the long term. The specific allocation to this category depends on what stage of development your specific knowledge is in and what the most valuable investment opportunities are at the current moment. Early in a career, when specific knowledge is being actively built, this category deserves significant allocation. Later, when specific knowledge is more established and the primary wealth building mechanism is financial asset compounding rather than capability compounding, the relative allocation may shift. The principle is to be honest about what stage you are in and what the most valuable form of investment is at that stage. The seventh step is what remains after the prior six allocations: discretionary consumption. This is the money available for recreation, entertainment, social spending, travel, and the full range of consumption activities that make life genuinely enjoyable rather than merely productive. I want to be clear that I regard this category as genuinely important and not as a residual to be minimized. Human life is not an optimization problem whose objective function is wealth accumulation, and a financial life organized entirely around wealth building at the expense of genuine enjoyment is not actually a good life, even if the financial metrics are excellent. The point is that discretionary consumption deserves to be explicitly what it is: consumption, not investment, and it deserves to be allocated deliberately rather than absorbed implicitly. When discretionary consumption comes last, after investment and capability development have been funded, it is spent from a position of choice rather than default. The experience of spending on enjoyment from a position of deliberate choice, knowing that your investment is funded, your obligations are met, your capabilities are being developed, is qualitatively different from the experience of spending on enjoyment from a position of default, where the enjoyment is consuming resources that were never explicitly allocated to anything else. The former produces genuine satisfaction. The latter produces a vague background anxiety about whether the spending is appropriate, which is a common experience among people who have not established a deliberate allocation discipline. Having described the 7 steps of the allocation sequence, I want to address several specific complications and nuances that arise in the practical implementation of this framework, because a framework that only functions under ideal conditions is not a useful framework. The first complication is income variability. The allocation sequence I have described assumes a predictable income that arrives on a schedule, the classic employment payday. For people with variable income, freelancers, entrepreneurs, commission-based earners, people with significant investment income, the income is neither predictable nor scheduled. And a payday-based allocation discipline does not directly translate. The adaptation required is to establish a target monthly allocation rather than a fixed payday allocation, and to maintain the discipline of sequencing relative to whatever income arrives in any given period. In high income months, the allocation sequence runs as described, and the surplus above the predetermined consumption level goes to investment. In low income months, the security buffer absorbs the shortfall without requiring changes to the investment allocation or the consumption base. This is why the security buffer is particularly important for people with variable income. It is what allows the investment allocation discipline to be maintained through income fluctuations without requiring constant recalibration. The second complication is the presence of significant existing debt. For a person carrying meaningful high interest debt, the investment allocation step and the debt repayment step are in direct competition for the same resources, and the right allocation between them depends on the interest rate of the debt relative to the expected return on the available investment vehicles. High interest consumer debt should in most cases take priority over long-term investment allocation, because the guaranteed return of eliminating high interest debt exceeds the expected return of investment in uncertain markets. Mortgage debt and low interest student debt are more ambiguous and deserve genuine analysis rather than automatic prioritization. The practical implementation is to treat high-interest debt repayment as a component of the investment allocation step rather than as a separate obligation. It is investment in the sense that it produces a guaranteed return, equivalent to the debt's interest rate. The third complication is the beginning stage, the person who is genuinely starting from a position where the income available after essential obligations leaves minimal discretionary allocation. The framework I have described requires a meaningful gap between income and essential expenses in order to function as designed. For a person where this gap is very small or non-existent, the immediate priority is not the allocation discipline, but the expansion of the gap through income development, through reduction of fixed obligations, or both. The allocation discipline is the right strategy for managing available resources toward wealth-building ends. It is not a substitute for the development of the income and the reduction of the obligations that create available resources in the first place. These are sequential problems. First, create the gap, then manage the gap intelligently. The fourth complication is the selection of specific investment vehicles where specifically The investment allocation should go once it has been separated from consumption. I have deliberately avoided specifying this up to this point because the allocation sequence is more important than the specific vehicles, and because the right vehicle selection depends on individual circumstances, tax situation, time horizon, risk tolerance, existing asset allocation that vary too much for any specific prescription to be universally applicable. What I can offer is a framework for thinking about vehicle selection that is consistent with the underlying philosophy. The first priority in vehicle selection is tax-advantaged accounts, any account structure that allows investment returns to compound without current taxation. In most jurisdictions, these are retirement accounts of various types, and the tax advantage they offer is among the most reliably high return features available in personal finance. The mathematical advantage of tax-deferred or tax-free compounding over decades is large enough that maximizing access to these structures should be among the first uses of the investment allocation for anyone who has access to them. The second priority is broad diversification in productive enterprises, the broadly diversified equity exposure that provides the structural advantages of ownership in the economy's ongoing productive activity without the specific company risk of concentrated individual stock positions. Index funds and equivalent structures that provide broad diversification at low cost are the most efficient implementation of this for most people. They are not exciting. They do not offer the potential for dramatic outperformance. They offer something more valuable: reliable access to the long-term structural advantage of equity ownership over cash and fixed income, with minimized costs and minimized idiosyncratic risk. The third priority for people who have meaningful assets and the specific knowledge to evaluate them appropriately is investment in individual productive enterprises, businesses, private investments, concentrated positions in areas of genuine specific knowledge. The caveat about specific knowledge is important. Investment in individual enterprises without genuine specific knowledge about those enterprises is not the expression of a value creation philosophy. It is speculation dressed in the language of investment, and it should be treated with the risk management appropriate to speculation. The advantage of specific knowledge in investment is not merely the ability to identify opportunities others miss. It is the ability to evaluate the genuine quality of what you are investing in, which is the foundational requirement for making investment decisions that are genuinely based on value rather than on narrative or momentum. I want to address the question of real estate specifically because it occupies a particular position in many people's financial thinking, positioned as a safe, reliable wealth building vehicle by cultural tradition and by the particular historical period of rising prices in many markets. Real estate is a genuine asset class with genuine wealth building potential, but the specific economics of any real estate investment depend on factors, local market conditions, financing terms, management requirements, tax implications that vary enough that general statements about its superiority or inferiority to other asset classes are not particularly useful. What I will say is that real estate should be evaluated with the same rigor as any other investment. What is the expected total return? What are the risks? What leverage is involved? What management burden is implied? And how does this compare to the alternatives available with the same capital? When real estate is evaluated on these terms rather than on cultural tradition, it is sometimes genuinely the best available vehicle and sometimes clearly not. An honest evaluation is more useful than presuming the answer in either direction. The fifth complication worth addressing is the psychological dimension of the allocation discipline, specifically how to maintain it through the periods of difficulty, doubt, and temptation that will inevitably arise. The allocation discipline I have described is not psychologically easy to maintain, especially in its early stages, when the visible results are modest and the consumption sacrifices are concrete and immediate. The investment account grows slowly at first. The capability development produces no immediate visible return. The security buffer sits idle month after month. Meanwhile, the consumption foregone is real and present, the vacation not taken, the upgrade deferred, the social spending constrained. The asymmetry between the immediate visibility of what is foregone and the long-term invisibility of what is being built is one of the primary reasons that financial disciplines are established and abandoned in cycles rather than sustained over the decades that compounding requires. The most useful psychological technology for maintaining the discipline through this asymmetry is the development of a genuine mental model of the future state toward which the discipline is building. Not a vague aspiration, financial independence, freedom from necessity, but a specific, vivid, concrete understanding of what the compounded result of the current discipline actually looks like over specific time horizons. What does my financial position look like in 5 years if I maintain this allocation discipline? In 10 years, what options become available at those points that are not available now? What constraints disappear? The more vivid and specific this mental model, the more real the long-term outcome feels relative to the immediate consumption being foregone, and the easier the discipline is to maintain. The second useful psychological technology is automating the discipline to the greatest extent possible, as I mentioned earlier. The decision to invest should be made once when you establish the allocation percentage and the automatic transfer mechanism, rather than at every payday. The less frequently the discipline requires active decision making, the less opportunity there is for the natural drift toward consumption to override it through the accumulation of reasonable sounding exceptions. The third useful technology is building community with people who share the same long-term financial orientation. The social environment in which you make financial decisions has a significant influence on the decisions you make, because humans are genuinely social creatures whose sense of what is normal and appropriate is shaped by what they observe in their immediate community. A person whose social environment is dominated by people who spend freely on status signals and lifestyle inflation will find the investment discipline chronically at odds with the implicit social norm. A person whose social environment includes people who are genuinely oriented toward long-term building and genuine wealth creation will find the discipline reinforced rather than undermined by social context. The sixth complication is the question of how the allocation discipline should evolve as your financial situation evolves, as income grows, as assets accumulate, as the gap between where you are and where you need to be narrows. The allocation discipline is not a static prescription to be maintained unchanged across all stages of financial life. It is a dynamic framework that should be recalibrated as circumstances change, always in service of the underlying objective, building the asset base that produces genuine financial independence. As income grows, the primary question is how to allocate the incremental income, the difference between current income and the income level at which the existing allocation was established. The default, in the absence of deliberate decision, is for incremental income to flow entirely into consumption through lifestyle inflation. The deliberate alternative is to direct a significant portion of incremental income to investment while allowing a modest portion to improve consumption quality in the specific categories that most directly improve genuine quality of life. The ratio between these two uses of incremental income is the variable that determines how rapidly your financial trajectory changes as income grows, as assets accumulate, and the financial independence threshold comes into view. As the point approaches at which investment returns alone could sustain your essential consumption, the character of the investment allocation changes from pure accumulation to a combination of accumulation and income generation. The specific knowledge required to navigate this transition from the accumulation phase to the distribution phase of financial life is different from the knowledge required to manage accumulation, and it deserves genuine attention rather than the assumption that the accumulation phase disciplines are simply continued indefinitely. I want to close with a reflection on what the payday discipline I have described is actually building toward, because the specific steps are most meaningful when they are understood in the context of the destination they are building toward. The destination is not a number. It is not a specific balance in a specific account at a specific age. The destination is a condition, the condition of having enough productive assets, enough income generating ownership, that your economic welfare is genuinely independent of the continuation of your labor income. The condition in which the work you choose to do is chosen freely from genuine interest and genuine purpose, rather than from financial necessity. This condition is what genuine financial independence actually means. Not the freedom to spend without constraint. That is not a stable condition, and it is not what most thoughtful people actually want. It is the freedom to choose your work based on its genuine value and your genuine interest in it, without the distortion of financial necessity shaping the choice. It is the condition in which your time is genuinely yours to allocate, and your energy is genuinely available for the things that matter most to you rather than being primarily consumed by the management of financial insufficiency. Every payday, executed according to the discipline I have described, is a step toward that condition, not a large step in isolation. A compounding step, one that contributes to a process that produces nonlinear results over time. The steps feel small because they are individually small. The destination feels large because it is genuinely large. The connection between the small steps and the large destination is compounding, and compounding requires only time and consistency to operate. The time is available. The consistency is a choice. The choice is made at every payday. It is made in the sequence of allocation, in the automation of investment, in the deliberateness of consumption, in the willingness to defer the present for the future, with enough clarity about the future to make the deferral genuinely meaningful rather than merely disciplined. It is made in the recognition that payday is not a moment of relief, but a moment of power, the moment at which the resources arrive that, allocated well and consistently over time, produce the only kind of financial security that is genuine, not the security of a steady paycheck, which stops when you stop, but the security of assets that generate income regardless of what you choose to do with your time. That is the destination. The payday discipline is the path. Every step on the path is the same step taken again. The compounding does the rest.